Hello, beautiful souls. Welcome back to Channel Name. I'm host Name, and today I have a story that proves one thing: never judge a book by its cover. Meet Helen, 72 years old, recently widowed, living alone in her beautiful family home. To everyone around her, she seemed like the perfect grandmother, kind, generous, maybe a little naive about money matters. Her own family thought they knew exactly who they were dealing with. They thought they had her all figured out. They were so wrong. What happened next is a masterclass in why you should never underestimate a woman just because she has silver hair and bakes cookies. This is a story about hidden strength, perfect timing, and the most satisfying revenge you'll ever hear. Trust me, you're gonna love how this one ends. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let me tell you about the day Helen's family learned that appearances can be very deceiving. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Patricia Whitmore's gavel struck the mahogany bench with 3 decisive blows. In the gallery, Helen Morrison sat perfectly still, her silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights, watching as her son David crumpled into his chair like a deflated balloon. Beside him, her daughter-in-law Sophie's mascara streaked down her cheeks in dark rivulets, her manicured hands trembling as she gripped the table's edge. The court hereby orders the defendants to pay restitution in the amount of $600,000 plus punitive damages. Judge Whitmore announced, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Furthermore, Mr. David Morrison, you are sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for elder fraud and conspiracy. David's head snapped up, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. His eyes found Helen's across the crowded courtroom, and for a moment time seemed suspended. She saw the exact instant when 25 years of carefully constructed lies crumbled away, when the son who had called her just a confused old lady finally understood that he had been outplayed by the very woman he'd dismissed as senile. Helen allowed herself the smallest of smiles, not triumphant but serene, like a grandmother watching her favorite grandchild finally solve a puzzle she'd been patiently guiding them toward. "But he doesn't know," she whispered to herself, the words barely audible above the courtroom's chaos, "that I heard every word of their plan 3 months ago." The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of shocked spectators. "All rise." But Helen was already standing, her posture straight as a dancer's, her dove-gray suit impeccable. As she turned to leave, reporters surged forward with their cameras and microphones. But she moved through them like water flowing around stones, graceful, unstoppable, utterly composed. "Mrs. Morrison, how does it feel to get justice?" a young journalist called out. Helen paused at the courtroom doors, her hand resting lightly on the brass handle. When she turned back, her smile was radiant, the kind that comes not from vindication, but from a deep, abiding peace. "Justice," she said softly, "is simply truth, finally finding its voice." 6 months earlier. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of 1247 Maple Street, casting delicate shadows across Helen's pristine kitchen. Everything was in its place. The vintage ceramic canisters lined up like soldiers on the marble countertop, the spotless farmhouse sink gleaming white as fresh snow, the herb garden visible through the window, arranged in perfect rows. This had been her domain for 32 years, the heart of a home where 3 children had grown up believing in the magic of Sunday morning pancakes and the safety of their mother's unconditional love. At 72, Helen Morrison moved through this familiar space with the same deliberate grace that had once commanded corporate boardrooms across 3 states. Her movements were economical, purposeful, a remnant from decades when every gesture had to convey authority to rooms full of men who assumed her silver hair meant diminished capacity rather than hard-earned wisdom. She was arranging white roses in a crystal vase when she heard David's key in the front door, followed by the sharp staccato of Sophie's heels across the hardwood floor. Helen glanced at the kitchen clock, 11:47 a.m. They were early for Sunday lunch, which meant they wanted something. In 30 years of marriage to their father and 12 years of widowhood since Robert's passing, Helen had learned to read the subtle signs of her family's needs, like a meteorologist reads storm patterns. "Mom," David's voice carried that particular tone, the one that meant he was preparing to ask for something, while simultaneously justifying why he deserved it. At 47, her eldest son had inherited his father's thick brown hair and easy smile, but somewhere along the way, he'd also acquired a sense of entitlement that Robert would have found deeply disappointing. "In the kitchen, sweetheart," Helen called, adding a final touch to her arrangement. The roses were from her garden varieties she'd cultivated for decades: Midas Touch, with their golden centers, Peace, with their cream and pink edges, and Double Delight, with their red-tipped petals, each one perfect, each one requiring patience and care to reach its full potential. David appeared in the doorway, his polo shirt crisp and his smile automatic. Behind him, Sophie clicked across the threshold in designer heels that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. At 39, Sophie possessed the kind of manufactured beauty that required constant maintenance, highlighted hair that never moved out of place, nails that gleamed like lacquered armor, and a wardrobe that spoke of someone who had never learned the difference between price and value. "Something smells incredible," David said, though Helen noticed his eyes weren't on the prime rib roasting in the oven, but on the folder of papers she'd left on the breakfast nook table. Financial documents partially visible beneath her reading glasses, and a cup of Earl Grey that had gone cold while she'd been reviewing investment statements. "Just the usual Sunday fare," Helen replied, watching as Sophie's gaze also drifted toward the table. Like vultures circling, she thought, then immediately chided herself for the uncharitable comparison. These were her children. Well, David was her child, and Sophie was complicated. "Actually, Mom, we wanted to talk to you about something." David began settling onto one of the kitchen bar stools with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his welcome. "Sophie and I have been thinking about your situation here." Helen's hand stilled on the roses. In her previous life, the one David and Sophie knew nothing about, she'd learned that when people began conversations with phrases like, "your situation," they were usually about to reveal their own motivations. "My situation." Sophie stepped forward, her smile bright as polished silver. "What David means is that we're worried about you rattling around in this big house all by yourself. It's so much work to maintain, and with your—" She paused delicately. "Well, at your age, we just think you might be happier, somewhere more manageable." The phrase, "at your age," hung in the air like an accusation. Helen had heard it increasingly often in recent months, always delivered with a concerned tilt of the head and a tone that suggested her 72 years had somehow rendered her incapable of making rational decisions. It was remarkable how quickly one's adult children could forget that those same years represented 7 decades of successfully navigating life's complexities. "I see," Helen said carefully. "And what sort of place did you have in mind?" David's enthusiasm kicked into high gear, the way it always did when he sensed an opportunity. "There's this amazing senior community about 20 minutes from our house, Sunset Manor. It's like a resort, mom, golf course, swimming pool, organized activities. You'd make so many new friends." Helen continued arranging her roses using the familiar motions to steady herself. "It sounds lovely, but I'm quite happy here." "But think about it practically," Sophie interjected, her voice taking on the patient tone one might use with a stubborn child. This house is worth almost $400,000. If you sold it and moved to Sunset Manor, you'd have all that equity freed up for your retirement. You could travel, spoil your grandchildren." She gestured vaguely toward the breakfast nook table. "Instead of worrying about managing all those complicated investments and bills." There it was. Helen felt something cold settle in her chest, not quite anger, not quite hurt, but something sharper and more clarifying. The complicated investments Sophie referred to included a diversified portfolio worth $1.2 million, 3 rental properties that generated steady income, and a retirement account that Helen had built through 30 years of financial expertise that neither David nor Sophie had ever bothered to understand. "The maintenance alone must be overwhelming," David added, warming to his theme. "The yard work, the repairs, keeping track of all the insurance and property taxes. Wouldn't it be nice to let someone else handle all that stress?" Helen placed the last rose in the arrangement and stepped back to admire her work. The flowers were beautiful, each bloom in perfect balance, with the others creating something greater than the sum of its parts. "You know your father and I planted the garden together, our first spring in this house," she said quietly. "The rose bushes were just tiny shoots then. It's taken 30 years for them to become what they are now." "Mom," David's voice carried a note of barely concealed impatience. "Gardens are nice, but you can't eat roses. We're talking about your financial security." "Are we?" Helen turned to face them, and for just a moment something flickered in her eyes, a sharpness that made Sophie take an involuntary step backward. But it passed so quickly that both younger people convinced themselves they'd imagined it. "Of course we are," Sophie said, reaching out to touch Helen's arm with fingers that felt cold even through the soft wool of her cardigan. "We love you, Helen. We just want what's best for you." Helen nodded slowly as if considering their words. In truth, she was considering something else entirely. The way David's eyes kept drifting to her financial papers, the way Sophie's voice grew sweeter when she talked about Helen's equity, the way neither of them had asked how she felt about leaving the home where she'd raised 3 children and buried a husband. "Well," she said finally, "it's certainly something to think about." David's face brightened. "Really? You'll consider it?" "I'll consider many things," Helen replied, which wasn't exactly what he'd asked but seemed to satisfy him. The rest of lunch passed in a blur of forced cheerfulness. Sophie complimented the roast beef while taking tiny bites that wouldn't disturb her lipstick. David regaled them with stories from his job at the insurance company, the same company where, unbeknownst to him, Helen had once been considered one of the most skilled fraud investigators on the West Coast. He spoke about his work with the casual authority of someone who'd never questioned his right to success, never doubted that his bachelor's degree in business had prepared him for anything the world might throw at him. "The Hendersons down the street just sold," Sophie mentioned casually as Helen served apple pie that she'd baked from scratch. "Got asking price within a week. The market's really hot right now for sellers." Helen made appropriate murmuring sounds while she calculated exactly how much research Sophie had done on local real estate values. Quite a bit, apparently. She filed this information away in the same mental compartment where she stored other interesting discrepancies, like the fact that David had mentioned Sunset Manor's amenities with suspicious specificity, or that Sophie had known almost exactly what Helen's house was worth, despite never having shown any previous interest in real estate. After they left, David promising to send her some brochures about senior communities. Sophie air-kissing her cheek with theatrical affection, Helen stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of family lunch. Dirty dishes filled the sink, crumbs dotted the countertop, and the scent of roast beef lingered in the air like an accusation. She moved through the cleanup with automatic efficiency, her mind working on an entirely different level. 30 years ago, when she'd been Margaret Helen Cartwright's senior claims investigator for Pacific Northwest Insurance, she'd specialized in a particular type of case: family fraud. Adult children who viewed their aging parents as retirement accounts with inconvenient opinions. Spouses who saw life insurance policies as solutions to marriage problems. The patterns were always the same, and once you learned to recognize them, they became as predictable as the phases of the moon. The phone rang just as she was loading the last plate into the dishwasher. "Helen, dear," the voice belonged to Margaret Finch, her next-door neighbor for 28 years. "I saw David and Sophie leave. How was lunch?" "Educational," Helen replied, which made Margaret laugh. "Oh, you always were too polite for your own good. Listen, I called because the strangest thing happened yesterday. A young man came by asking questions about you: whether you lived alone, how you managed the house, if you seemed competent to handle your affairs." Helen's hand tightened on the receiver. "Did he say who he was?" "Claimed to be from some senior services organization. Very official-looking clipboard business card, the whole 9 yards. But something about him rubbed me the wrong way, so I told him he'd have to speak to you directly." Margaret paused. "Helen, you haven't been having any problems. Have you memory issues or anything like that?" "No," Helen said slowly. "No problems at all." "What did this man look like?" "Tall brown hair, nice smile. Reminded me a bit of David, actually, if David were about 10 years younger and dressed like a social worker." Helen thanked Margaret and hung up, her mind racing. A social worker who looked like David asking questions about her competency the day after David and Sophie's surprise visit. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, and Helen had long ago stopped believing in coincidences when it came to family and money. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom, her movements deliberate and unhurried. To any observer, she looked like exactly what she was supposed to be: a wealthy widow in her 70s. Perhaps feeling the weight of a large house and complex financial responsibilities. But Helen Morrison had spent 30 years reading between the lines of human nature, and she'd learned that the most dangerous predators were often the ones who smiled the sweetest. Her bedroom was a sanctuary of soft blues and creams, dominated by the king-sized bed she'd shared with Robert for 3 decades. On her dresser sat framed photographs spanning 50 years: her wedding day, the children's graduations, family vacations, Robert's retirement party. A life well lived, captured in silver frames and fading colors. But it was the photograph tucked behind the others that told a different story. In it, a younger Helen stood in a conference room full of serious-faced men in suits, accepting an award for outstanding achievement in financial crimes investigation. The plaque in her hands read, "Margaret Helen Cartwright, Pacific Northwest Insurance Investigator of the Year." She was wearing a navy blue power suit and an expression of quiet satisfaction, the look of someone who'd just closed a case that had taken 3 years to build. Helen pulled out her laptop, a sleek modern machine that would have surprised David and Sophie, who probably assumed she still used a typewriter for correspondence. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency as she opened a file she hadn't touched in 12 years. It was labeled simply HC Investigative Methods, and it contained everything she'd learned about uncovering financial fraud during her 3 decades in the insurance industry. Some habits, she reflected, never truly died. They just waited patiently for the right circumstances to prove their worth again. She began with the basics: a reverse phone directory search for the number of the social worker who'd visited Margaret. The number traced back to a cell phone registered to someone named Marcus Webb, a name that meant nothing to her, but phone records were just the beginning of any proper investigation. Next, she accessed her bank accounts online, something she did weekly, but now examined with professional scrutiny. Everything appeared normal at first glance, but Helen had learned to look beyond the obvious. She pulled up 6 months of statements and began cross-referencing dates, amounts, and transaction patterns. That's when she found it. 3 weeks ago, on a Thursday afternoon, when she'd been at her book club meeting, someone had attempted to access her accounts from a computer at the Riverside Public Library. The attempt had been unsuccessful. Her passwords were far more sophisticated than most people would expect from a woman her age, but the digital footprint was there, buried in the security logs that most people never bothered to check. Helen leaned back in her chair, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with disturbing clarity. The timing of David and Sophie's visit, the questions about her competency, the suggestion that her financial management was becoming overwhelming, the mysterious social worker gathering intelligence about her daily routine. She'd seen this pattern before dozens of times in case files that had crossed her desk throughout her career. Adult children who convinced themselves that their parents' money was rightfully theirs, that advancing age automatically meant diminished capacity, that a few strategic moves could solve their own financial problems, while simultaneously helping an elderly relative who was clearly struggling. The cruelest part was how easy it could be. A few calls to Adult Protective Services expressing concern about an aging parent, some carefully planted evidence of confusion or forgetfulness, a sympathetic judge who saw a loving family trying to protect a vulnerable senior citizen. Before you knew it, a perfectly competent adult could find themselves declared incompetent, their assets under the control of the very people who'd orchestrated their downfall. Helen Morrison had sent 17 people to prison for exactly this type of fraud, but Margaret Helen Cartwright was about to come out of retirement. The next morning, Helen drove to the Riverside Public Library, an institution she knew well from her weekly volunteer shifts reading to children. But today, she wasn't interested in picture books or story time. She wanted to have a conversation with the head librarian about their computer usage policies and whether they kept any security footage of their internet terminals. "Of course we keep footage," said Janet Williams, a woman Helen's age, who'd run the library with military precision for 15 years. "Identity theft is a real problem these days. We keep everything for 60 days before recycling the files." "Why do you ask?" Helen explained about the attempted access to her accounts, watching Janet's expression shift from concern to outrage. "Someone tried to hack your bank account from our computers." Janet's voice could have cut glass. "Helen, we can pull that footage right now. Do you know what day it was?" 20 minutes later, Helen found herself staring at a computer screen that showed security footage from 3 weeks ago. The image quality wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. At 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, a young man with brown hair and a laptop bag had sat down at Terminal 7 and spent 43 minutes attempting to access various financial websites. The man's face was turned away from the camera for most of the session, but at 3:22 p.m., he'd looked up to check the time on the wall clock behind him. Helen's breath caught in her throat. The face on the screen belonged to Marcus Webb, all right. But she knew him by another name, Tommy Morrison, David's 26-year-old son from his first marriage, her own grandson. The pieces of the puzzle weren't just clicking into place, now they were slamming together with the force of a revelation that made Helen's chest tight with something between betrayal and fury. This wasn't just about David and Sophie wanting her money. This was a multi-generational conspiracy that involved turning her own grandson into a criminal. She thanked Janet and drove home in a daze, her mind reeling with implications. How long had they been planning this? What role was Tommy supposed to play? And most importantly, what exactly did they intend to do once they'd gathered enough evidence of her supposed incompetence? Back in her kitchen, surrounded by the familiar comfort of her roses and her gleaming appliances, Helen Morrison made a decision that would have sent chills down David's spine if he'd been capable of recognizing the woman his mother used to be. She pulled out her laptop again and began typing with the focused intensity of someone building a case. But this time, she wasn't investigating strangers for an insurance company. This time, it was personal, and Margaret Helen Cartwright had never lost a case. Helen stared at the frozen image of her grandson's face on Janet's computer screen until the words blurred together. Tommy, sweet Tommy, who used to spend summer weeks at her house building elaborate Lego cities on her living room floor. Tommy, who'd called her Grandma Nell because he couldn't pronounce Helen when he was little. Tommy, who'd hugged her tight at his grandfather's funeral and whispered, "Don't worry, Grandma, I'll always take care of you." Now 26 and apparently willing to commit felonies for his father's approval. The drive home passed in a haze of conflicting emotions. Helen found herself gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white, then deliberately relaxing her hands, then tensing up again as another wave of hurt crashed over her. She'd prosecuted enough family fraud cases to know the statistics 90% of elder financial abuse was committed by family members. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it personally were two entirely different kinds of knowledge. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the house that Robert had bought for their young family 43 years ago. They'd painted the shutters together that first spring, argued about the color of the front door. She'd wanted blue, he'd insisted on green, and they'd compromised on a soft gray blue that still made her smile. This was the house where she'd nursed 3 babies through colic and chickenpox, where she'd helped with countless homework assignments, where she'd taught David to ride a bicycle and bandaged his scraped knees when he fell. Where had she gone wrong? The question hit her like a physical blow, making her chest tight with something that felt suspiciously like guilt. Had she been too generous over the years? Too quick to help when David's business ventures failed, or when Sophie needed money for her various projects? Had her success in business made them feel entitled to her wealth? Or was this simply what happened when love became twisted by greed and entitlement? Helen Morrison had always prided herself on being a pragmatic woman. 30 years in insurance fraud investigation had taught her that people were capable of remarkable cruelty when money was involved. But Margaret Helen Cartwright, the professional investigator, had always been able to maintain emotional distance from her cases. The victims were strangers, sympathetic certainly, but not people who'd sat at her kitchen table every Sunday for decades. This was different. This was David, her firstborn, the baby she'd rocked through countless sleepless nights. This was Sophie, who'd worn Helen's grandmother's pearls at her wedding and promised to love David for richer or poorer. This was Tommy, who still sent her hand-drawn birthday cards, even though he was 26 years old. And yet, Helen pulled out her phone and scrolled through her recent call log until she found David's number. 3 calls in the past 2 weeks, all lasting less than 5 minutes. Brief, efficient conversations where he'd asked about her health, mentioned how busy he was at work, and promised to visit soon. She tried to remember the last time he'd called just to chat, the last time he'd asked about her book club, or her garden, or whether she'd seen any good movies lately. She couldn't. When had their relationship become so transactional? When had she stopped being his mother and started being simply a source of potential inheritance? The hurt was sharp and immediate, but underneath it, something else was building. Something cooler, more analytical. Something that felt remarkably like the mindset she'd cultivated during 30 years of hunting down liars and thieves. Helen got out of the car and walked slowly up the flagstone path. Robert had laid himself noting details with the same systematic attention she'd once applied to crime scenes. The mailbox that David had installed last spring, when her old one finally rusted through a gesture she thought was loving thoughtfulness, but which now took on a different meaning. How often did he check her mail when he visited? What bills had he seen? What financial information had he gathered during those dutiful son visits? Inside, she made herself a cup of tea with the automatic movements of long habit, but her mind was working on an entirely different level. She pulled out a yellow legal pad, old habits from her investigation days, and began making lists. What I know. David and Sophie want me to sell the house and move to senior living. Someone claiming to be a social worker asked neighbors about my competency. Tommy attempted to access my bank accounts from the library. This suggests a coordinated effort over time. They believe I'm becoming confused or overwhelmed. What I need to find out. How long have they been planning this? What other steps have they taken? Who else is involved? What's their end game? Is there a timeline? Helen paused, her pen hovering over the paper. The investigator in her knew exactly how to proceed: systematic evidence gathering, careful documentation, building an airtight case before making any moves. But the mother in her kept hoping this was all some terrible misunderstanding, that there was an innocent explanation that would allow her to go back to believing in Sunday dinners and family loyalty. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. David's name appeared on the caller ID. "Hi, sweetheart," she answered, proud that her voice sounded perfectly normal. "Hey, Mom, how are you feeling today?" The question struck her as odd. She'd felt fine yesterday at lunch, fine this morning, fine until she'd discovered her grandson was apparently moonlighting as a cyber criminal. "I'm well, thank you. Why do you ask?" "Oh, you just seemed a little, tired yesterday. Sophie and I were worried." "Tired." Helen wrote the word on her legal pad and drew a circle around it. "I felt perfectly fine yesterday. And today." "That's good to hear." There was something in David's tone, a careful neutrality that set off every alarm bell Helen had developed during her professional career. "Listen, I wanted to follow up on our conversation about Sunset Manor. I drove by there this morning and it really is beautiful. Would you like me to arrange a tour?" This morning, Helen glanced at the kitchen clock. It was 2:30 p.m. "You drove by a senior community on a Monday afternoon." A pause. "I had a client meeting nearby." Helen wrote client meeting on her pad and circled that too. David worked in commercial insurance sales. His territory covered the industrial district on the opposite side of town from Sunset Manor. "Of course. Well, I'm still thinking about our conversation." "Mom, I hope you know this is coming from a place of love. Sophie and I just want what's best for you." There it was again, that phrase that had become their mantra. Helen had heard it enough times in her professional life to recognize it as the rallying cry of adult children who'd convinced themselves that their financial convenience was somehow aligned with their parents' best interests. "I know you do, sweetheart," she said, and meant it. That was perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this whole situation. She did believe that David loved her in his way. He'd simply convinced himself that stealing from her was actually helping her. After she hung up, Helen sat in her kitchen for a long time, staring at the notes she'd made. The afternoon light slanted through her lace curtains, casting familiar shadows across the table where she'd signed homework and paid bills and planned family vacations for 4 decades. This room had been the heart of her family life, the place where important decisions were made and difficult conversations were held. Now it was about to become her war room. She opened her laptop and began a new document: investigation notes, case file number 1. Beneath it, she typed a date and a single line that would have made her former colleagues proud: subject suspected elder financial abuse, perpetrators family members, status investigation initiated. Then she paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Once she started down this path, there would be no going back. Evidence would be gathered, truths would be uncovered, and the comfortable illusions of family loyalty would be shattered forever. David and Sophie and Tommy would go from being the people she loved most in the world to being the subjects of a criminal investigation. But they'd made that choice when they decided she was too old and confused to notice their machinations. They'd made that choice when they'd involved her grandson in attempted bank fraud. They'd made that choice when they'd started planning her future without bothering to ask what she wanted. Helen Morrison might be 72 years old, but Margaret Helen Cartwright was just getting started. She began typing, and with each keystroke she felt herself transforming. The hurt and betrayal were still there, would always be there probably, but they were being channeled into something more useful. Something that felt remarkably like the focused determination that had once made her one of the most successful fraud investigators on the West Coast. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Sophie. "Hi, Helen. Found some lovely brochures for senior communities. Mind if we drop them by tomorrow evening? XOXO." Helen stared at the message for a long moment, noting the timing. Less than 2 hours after David's call, Sophie was ready to advance their agenda. They were working together, coordinating their approach, treating her like a mark to be worked, rather than a family member to be consulted. She typed back, "Of course, dear. I'll make dinner. See you at 6. Then she added a new line to her investigation notes. "Tomorrow evening, subjects will visit with additional pressure materials. Opportunity for evidence gathering." Helen Morrison was going to make them dinner and smile and listen to their pitch with every appearance of confused gratitude. But Margaret Helen Cartwright was going to be taking notes. And after 30 years of hunting down people who thought they were smarter than she was, Margaret Helen Cartwright had never met a criminal she couldn't outsmart, even when that criminal happened to be her own son. Helen woke at 5:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning, not because her alarm had sounded, but because her mind had been working all night like a computer processing data in the background. She lay in the pre-dawn darkness listening to the familiar sounds of her house settling around her, the soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the gentle tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the whisper of wind through the maple tree outside her bedroom window. These were the sounds of home, of safety, of a life well built. But this morning they felt different. This morning they sounded like the soundtrack to a fortress under siege. She rose and dressed with the same methodical care she'd once brought to preparing for depositions. Navy slacks, cream blouse, comfortable flats that wouldn't slow her down if she needed to move quickly. Then she made her way to the kitchen and began the ritual that had sustained her through 30 years of complex investigations, strong coffee and careful planning. The yellow legal pad from yesterday sat on her kitchen table, covered with notes that looked innocuous enough to anyone who might glance at them. But Helen knew that every successful investigation began with organization. She opened her laptop and created a new folder structure that would have made her former colleagues proud. Case files, family investigation, evidence documents, photos, recordings, timeline, key dates and activities, financial analysis, bank records, property documents, communications, emails, text, phone records, witnesses, potential allies and sources, legal strategy options and consequences. She'd built hundreds of cases this way, methodically gathering facts until the truth became undeniable. The difference this time was that instead of hunting strangers who defrauded insurance companies, she was hunting her own family. The irony wasn't lost on her. For 3 decades, she'd specialized in cases where family members exploited elderly relatives. Cases that had made her simultaneously grateful for her own loving family and heartbroken for the victims who'd trusted the wrong people. She'd testified in court dozens of times about the warning signs of elder abuse, the predictable patterns of financial exploitation, the psychology of adult children who convinced themselves that stealing was somehow helping. Now she was living inside one of those case studies. Helen poured herself a second cup of coffee and opened her banking website. Most people her age she knew barely understood online banking beyond checking their balance. But Helen had been an early adopter of digital investigation techniques, and she'd kept her skills current even after retirement. She might be 72, but she could navigate financial databases and security protocols with the same ease that David probably used to order takeout. She started with her primary checking account downloading 6 months of statements and importing them into a spreadsheet. Then her savings account, her investment portfolio, her credit cards, and finally the accounts for her 3 rental properties. It was tedious work, but Helen had learned long ago that financial crimes always left digital breadcrumbs. You just had to know how to follow them. Pattern recognition had always been her gift. Where other investigators saw random numbers and dates, Helen saw stories. A series of small withdrawals that coincidentally matched someone's mortgage payments, ATM transactions that formed a geographic pattern, revealing secret meetings, credit card charges that contradicted sworn statements about whereabouts and activities. This morning, she was looking for her own story in the data, and she found it. 3 months ago, someone had accessed her online banking system from an IP address that wasn't her home computer. The login had been successful, meaning they'd known her password and had lasted 17 minutes. During that time, they'd downloaded statements for all of her accounts and viewed her investment portfolio in detail. Helen sat back in her chair feeling something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't just casual curiosity about their future inheritance. This was systematic intelligence gathering, the kind of financial reconnaissance that preceded major fraud. She cross-referenced the date with her calendar. March 15th had been a Wednesday. She'd been at her monthly garden club meeting from 2 to 5 p.m., something she'd mentioned to David during their Sunday dinner the week before. He'd even asked about it specifically, whether she was still enjoying the meetings, whether they kept her busy, whether she'd be out all afternoon. At the time, she'd thought he was just making conversation. Now she realized he'd been establishing her schedule. Helen opened a new browser window and navigated to a website that most people her age had never heard of, a professional database for private investigators and forensic accountants. Her login credentials were 12 years old, but the account was still active. Margaret Helen Cartwright's professional membership had been kept current by colleagues who understood that retirement didn't necessarily mean the end of one's usefulness. She ran a comprehensive background check on her own son. What she found made her hands shake. David Morrison wasn't just facing the usual middle-aged financial pressures of mortgage payments and college tuition. He was drowning. His credit score had dropped 80 points in the past year. He'd taken out 3 separate personal loans, maxing out the credit lines. His business expenses suggested someone living well beyond his means. Expensive restaurant charges, luxury hotel stays, purchases at high-end electronics stores. Most damning of all was a series of cash advances from his credit cards, totaling nearly $15,000 over the past 6 months. Cash advances were the financial equivalent of a cry for help, the kind of desperate move people made when they couldn't qualify for legitimate loans. Helen printed the credit report and added it to a growing file folder. Then she did something that felt like stepping off a cliff. She ran the same background check on Sophie. Sophie's financial picture was even more disturbing. Her credit cards were maxed out. Her car was 3 months behind on payments, and she declared bankruptcy 4 years ago, something they'd never mentioned to Helen. But most interesting were the employment records. According to the database, Sophie had worked for a company called Senior Care Solutions for 8 months last year. Helen typed the company name into a search engine and felt her blood pressure spike. Senior Care Solutions was currently under federal investigation for elder abuse. Their business model involved identifying wealthy seniors who lived alone, then systematically isolating them from family and friends while draining their assets through fraudulent care services and legal manipulation. The FBI had shut them down 6 months ago, and 17 employees were facing criminal charges. Sophie had listed her job title as Client Assessment Specialist. Helen reached for her coffee cup with trembling hands, then thought better of it. Caffeine was the last thing she needed right now. She was already running on pure adrenaline, her mind racing through implications and connections with the systematic precision that had once made her legendary in the insurance industry. Sophie knew how to identify vulnerable seniors. Sophie knew how to manipulate the legal system to gain control of elderly people's assets. And Sophie had been studying Helen's financial situation for months, possibly years. This wasn't just family greed. This was professional-grade elder abuse. Helen's phone buzzed with a text from David. Looking forward to tonight. Sophie found some great information about senior communities. Think you'll be impressed. She stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back. Can't wait to see what she's found. But she wasn't thinking about senior communities. She was thinking about the fact that in her professional life, she'd sent people to prison for exactly what David and Sophie were planning to do to her. And she was thinking about how satisfying it was going to be to turn the tables on them. Helen Morrison spent the rest of the morning playing the role of a lonely widow, puttering around her house. She watered her plants, sorted through mail, and made a grocery list for tonight's dinner. Anyone watching would have seen exactly what they expected to see: an elderly woman going through the mundane routines of retirement. But Margaret Helen Cartwright spent the morning setting up a sophisticated surveillance operation. She positioned a digital recorder behind the fruit bowl on her kitchen counter, angled to capture conversation from the dining room. She tested the battery life and audio quality, making sure every word would be preserved. Then she set up her laptop in the living room with a program running that would record both audio and video through the built-in camera. Finally, she called her attorney. Richard Hawthorne had been Robert's friend since college and Helen's lawyer for 20 years. He was also one of the few people who knew about her previous career as Margaret Helen Cartwright. When she'd asked him to keep that information confidential after Robert's death, to let David and Sophie continue believing she was just a housewife who'd gotten lucky with investments, Richard had agreed without question. Now she was grateful for his discretion. "Helen," Richard's voice was warm with genuine affection. "How are you holding up?" "I'm well, Richard. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer as my lawyer, not my friend." His tone shifted immediately. "All right, what's going on?" Helen took a deep breath. "If someone were systematically planning to have me declared incompetent in order to gain control of my assets, what would that look like, legally speaking?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. "Helen," Richard said finally, his voice very careful. "Are you asking about a hypothetical situation, or are you telling me you think someone is actually doing this to you?" "I'm telling you that my son and daughter-in-law have been researching my financial situation without my knowledge that someone attempted to hack my bank accounts, and that they're pressuring me to move to a senior community while expressing concerns about my ability to manage my affairs." Another silence. Then, "Jesus Christ, Helen, how long has this been going on?" "I'm not sure. I only started investigating yesterday." She paused. "Richard, I need you to know something else. I've been doing this investigation using skills they don't know I have. David and Sophie think I'm just a confused old woman who got lucky with Robert's life insurance. They have no idea that I spent 30 years hunting down people exactly like them." Richard's laugh was short and sharp. "They have no idea who they're messing with, do they? None whatsoever. And I intend to keep it that way until I have enough evidence to destroy them completely. What do you need from me?" Helen felt a rush of gratitude for this man who'd been her friend for 2 decades. and who understood without question that she was perfectly capable of handling her own defense. I need to know the legal procedures for declaring someone incompetent. I need to understand what evidence they'd need, what the timeline would look like, and how to counter it when they make their move. I'll have a full brief ready for you by tomorrow morning, Richard said. But Helen, if they're really planning what you think they're planning, you need to be very careful. People who are desperate enough to defraud their own family are capable of extreme measures. Helen looked around her kitchen at the cheerful yellow walls Robert had painted to match her favorite roses at the family photos covering the refrigerator at the cookbook collection that represented 40 years of Sunday dinners and holiday feasts. Richard, she said softly, I spent 3 decades putting people in prison for financial fraud. Some of them were desperate. Some of them were dangerous. Some of them were my friends. She paused, letting that sink in. I've never been afraid of desperate people, and I've never lost a case. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Helen had uncovered enough evidence to convince any prosecutor to file charges, but she wasn't satisfied with enough. She wanted overwhelming. She wanted undeniable. She wanted David and Sophie to walk into her dining room tonight completely confident in their plan, never suspecting that they were actually walking into a trap. She'd spent the early afternoon expanding her investigation beyond her immediate family, using database searches and public records to map out the full scope of what she was dealing with. What she'd found was both more extensive and more disturbing than she'd initially imagined. Sophie's connection to Senior Care Solutions wasn't just a coincidence, it was the foundation of their entire strategy. Helen had managed to access archived training materials from the company's website materials that read like a how-to manual for elder abuse. Identifying isolation opportunities, creating dependency relationships, legal pathways to asset control. Reading through these documents was like studying her own future as Sophie had planned it. The methodology was sophisticated and deeply evil. First, identify elderly targets who lived alone and had substantial assets. Second, infiltrate their social circles to assess vulnerabilities and gather intelligence. Third, create artificial crises that would justify intervention, medical emergencies, home maintenance disasters, or carefully orchestrated accidents that demonstrated the senior's inability to care for themselves. Fourth, use these manufactured crises to convince family members that immediate action was necessary for the senior's safety. Fifth, expedite legal proceedings while the elderly person was still confused or recovering, often gaining power of attorney or guardianship before the victim fully understood what was happening. It was brilliant, thorough, and absolutely monstrous. Helen printed every page of the training materials, her anger growing with each new revelation. This wasn't just about her money. This was about a systematic assault on her autonomy, her dignity, and her right to make decisions about her own life. Sophie had been trained to view elderly people not as human beings, but as problems to be solved through legal manipulation and emotional warfare. And David had willingly made his own mother into Sophie's next project. She was cross-referencing court records when her doorbell rang. Helen glanced at the clock, 3:45 p.m., and felt her pulse quicken. They weren't supposed to arrive until 6. Early arrival was either a sign of overconfidence or desperation, and neither option was reassuring. She minimized her computer screens and walked to the front door, taking a moment to compose herself into the role of confused elderly woman that David and Sophie expected to see. But when she opened the door, it wasn't David and Sophie standing on her porch. It was Tommy. Her grandson looked terrible, pale, unshaven, and wearing clothes that suggested he'd slept in his car. His brown hair, usually neat and stylish, was disheveled, and his eyes held the kind of desperate exhaustion that Helen recognized from her professional life. She'd seen that look before in the faces of people who'd gotten in over their heads and finally realized the true cost of their choices. Grandma Nell, he said, his voice cracking slightly on the childhood nickname. Can I come in? I need to talk to you. Helen's investigator instinct screamed warnings. Tommy was part of the conspiracy. Tommy had tried to hack her bank accounts. Tommy was probably here to gather more intelligence for his father. But her grandmother instincts, honed by 26 years of loving this boy, recognized something else in his face: fear, guilt, and underneath it all, a desperate hope that maybe somehow she could help him find a way out of whatever mess he'd gotten himself into. She stepped aside and let him in. Tommy collapsed onto her living room sofa like a marionette whose strings had been cut, putting his head in his hands. Grandma, I've done something terrible, and I don't know how to fix it. Helen sat down across from him, every nerve in her body alert. This could be part of the plan, the remorseful grandson act, designed to lower her guard before tonight's main event. But Tommy's distress seemed genuine, and Helen had decades of experience reading people under stress. Tell me, she said simply. The story that poured out of Tommy confirmed most of what Helen had already discovered, but added layers of detail that made her heart ache. David had approached his son 6 months ago with what he'd called a family intervention. Helen was getting forgetful, David had explained. She was making poor financial decisions, forgetting to pay bills, showing signs of early dementia that she was too proud to acknowledge. As her grandson and someone who worked in technology, Tommy's job was to help assess the scope of the problem by checking her online accounts. Not to steal anything, David had emphasized, just to see whether she was managing her finances responsibly or whether the family needed to step in for her own protection. He made it sound like we were helping you, Tommy said, his voice muffled by his hands. Like we were the good guys trying to save you from yourself. Helen felt a familiar mixture of rage and professional admiration. David had used exactly the right psychological manipulation, appealing to Tommy's love for his grandmother while providing a noble justification for criminal behavior. It was textbook emotional manipulation, the kind that turned ordinary people into unwitting accomplices. But when I tried to access your accounts, Tommy continued, they were locked down tighter than Fort Knox. Your passwords weren't anything Dad said they'd be. Your security settings were more sophisticated than most banks use. And I realized, he looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. I realized that someone who was losing their memory couldn't possibly have set up that kind of digital security. Helen kept her expression carefully neutral. What did you do then? I told Dad the accounts were too secure for me to access. I thought that would be the end of it. Tommy's laugh was bitter. But then Sophie got involved. She started talking about other ways to prove you were incompetent, staging accidents, getting you to say confused things on recording, finding ways to make you look like you couldn't take care of yourself. Helen's blood ran cold. Staging accidents. Tommy nodded miserably. Like making you fall down the stairs. Or leaving the stove on and then discovering it when they came to visit. Little things that would look like normal senior moments, but would add up to a pattern of unsafe behavior. The investigator in Helen was fascinated by the sophistication of their planning. The grandmother in Helen was devastated by the casual cruelty of it. They were willing to physically endanger her, to potentially cause her serious injury in order to strengthen their legal case for incompetency. Tommy, she said carefully, are you telling me this because you've changed your mind about helping them? Her grandson's face crumpled. Grandma, I've been having nightmares for weeks. Every time I think about you getting hurt because of something I helped plan. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. You've always been the best person in our family. You've never been anything but loving and generous and kind, and we're planning to destroy your life for money. Helen reached across the coffee table and took Tommy's hands in hers. They were shaking. I've been trying to figure out how to warn you without getting myself arrested, he continued. Dad says I'm already an accessory because I tried to hack your accounts. He says if I don't follow through with the plan, he'll tell the police I was acting alone. Now Helen understood why Tommy looked so desperate. David wasn't just using his son as an accomplice, he was setting him up as a scapegoat. If the plan went wrong, Tommy would take the fall while David and Sophie claimed they'd been trying to stop him. It was exactly the kind of betrayal that Helen had seen dozens of times in her professional life. Family loyalty was a one-way street for people like David. They expected it from others, but felt no obligation to provide it themselves. Tommy, Helen said gently, what if I told you that I'm not nearly as helpless as your father thinks I am? He looked up at her with confused hope. What do you mean? Helen made a decision that went against every investigative instinct she developed over 30 years. She was about to reveal her hand to someone who might still be working against her, but looking at her grandson's face, seeing the genuine remorse and terror there, she decided to take the risk. I mean that your father and Sophie have made one very serious mistake, she said. They assumed I was just a lucky widow who happened to inherit some money. They never bothered to find out how I actually built the wealth they're trying to steal. She walked to her desk and pulled out the framed photograph she'd been looking at yesterday, the one showing a younger Helen accepting an award for outstanding achievement in financial crimes investigation. Tommy stared at the photo in silence for nearly a minute. You were a cop, he whispered. Not a cop, an insurance investigator. I specialized in financial fraud for 30 years. Helen sat back down across from him. I sent 47 people to prison for doing exactly what your father and Sophie are planning to do to me. Tommy's face went through a series of expressions, shock, disbelief, understanding, and finally something that might have been relief. You know what they're planning. I've known since yesterday, and I've been building a case against them ever since. Helen leaned forward. Tommy, I'm going to offer you a choice. You can continue helping your father and Sophie, in which case you'll go to prison along with them. Or you can help me stop them. You can stop them. Helen's smile was cold as winter moonlight. Sweetheart, I've been hunting people like your father since before you were born. The only question is whether you want to be part of the solution or part of the problem. Tommy didn't hesitate. I want to help. I want to stop them. I want to make this right. Good, Helen said, because they're coming over for dinner in 2 hours and we have work to do. The next 90 minutes transformed Helen's peaceful home into the nerve center of a precision operation. She and Tommy worked with the focused intensity of a surgical team, preparing for what Helen privately thought of as the most important performance of her life. Tommy's insider knowledge proved invaluable. He knew exactly what David and Sophie were planning to present tonight, a carefully prepared portfolio of senior living options, financial management services, and legal documents that would gradually transfer control of Helen's assets to them for her own protection. He also knew their timeline. They wanted everything finalized within 6 weeks before Helen could change her mind or seek outside advice. They're planning to record tonight's conversation, Tommy told her as they tested the positioning of Helen's hidden cameras. Sophie bought a digital recorder. The idea is to get you saying things that sound confused or overwhelmed, then use those recordings as evidence of incompetency. Helen nodded grimly. She'd seen this tactic before, selective editing of recorded conversations to create false impressions of mental decline. It was remarkably effective with judges who were already predisposed to believe that elderly people were naturally vulnerable and in need of protection. What else? She asked. Tommy pulled out his phone and showed her a document. This is a power of attorney form that Sophie's going to suggest you sign just in case something happens. She says it's standard estate planning, but if you sign it, it gives Dad immediate control over all your financial decisions. Helen photographed the document with her own phone, noting the law firm's letterhead. Another piece of evidence for her growing file. They're not wasting any time, are they? Sophie says the longer they wait, the more chance there is that you'll deteriorate to the point where you can't legally sign anything. They want to get the paperwork done while you're still considered competent. The irony was staggering. They were rushing to complete their fraud while Helen was still legally capable of consent, never realizing that her competency was exactly what would destroy them. Helen's laptop chimed with an incoming email from Richard Hawthorne. The legal brief she'd requested had arrived, and it confirmed her worst fears about David and Sophie's strategy. Under current law, they could petition for emergency guardianship if they could demonstrate that Helen was in immediate danger due to her inability to care for herself. The process could be completed in as little as 72 hours if they had the right evidence. Evidence they were planning to manufacture tonight. "Tommy," Helen said, closing the laptop, "I need you to understand something. What we're about to do is going to destroy your relationship with your father permanently. Even if he avoids prison, which he won't, he'll never forgive you for choosing my side over his." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the kitchen window at the garden where he'd played as a child. "Grandma, my dad stopped being my dad the minute he decided to hurt you. The person who's coming over here tonight, that's not the man who taught me to ride a bike or helped me with my homework. That's someone I don't recognize." Helen felt her heart break a little for this young man who was learning one of life's hardest lessons, that sometimes the people we love most are capable of betraying us in ways we never thought possible. "There's something else," Tommy continued. "Something I haven't told you yet." He took a deep breath. "Sophie's been talking about what happens after they get control of your assets. She wants to sell this house and put you in the cheapest care facility they can find. She says once the legal paperwork is done, you won't have any choice in the matter." Helen's hands clenched into fists before she could stop them. This house wasn't just property, it was 43 years of memories, the place where she'd built a life with Robert and raised their children. The idea of Sophie casually planning to strip that away from her to warehouse her in some institutional setting while they enjoyed the proceeds from selling her home filled Helen with a fury that was almost physical in its intensity. But fury, she reminded herself, was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. She needed to channel that anger into cold, systematic planning. She opened her laptop again and began typing a new document, Operation Notes, Evening Encounter. Beneath it, she outlined exactly how the next few hours would unfold. 6:00 p.m. David and Sophie arrive. Hidden recording devices active. Tommy positioned as backup witness. Helen plays confused elderly woman role. Let them present their solutions. 6:30 p.m. Dinner conversation. Allow them to pressure about power of attorney. Record any admissions about their true intentions. Tommy observes their manipulation tactics. 7:30 p.m. The revelation. Helen reveals her true identity and evidence. Tommy confirms their criminal conspiracy. Offer them choice voluntary restitution or prosecution. 8:00 p.m. Aftermath. Document their responses. Secure additional admissions if possible. Begin formal legal proceedings. Helen read through the timeline twice, then looked up at Tommy. "Are you ready for this?" He nodded, though she could see the nervousness in his eyes. "What do you need me to do? Be yourself. Be the grandson who loves his grandmother and is horrified by what his father is planning, but also be my witness. I need someone else to hear whatever they say tonight, someone who can testify that they weren't entrapped or coerced into making admissions." Tommy's face hardened with determination. "I can do that." Helen stood up and smoothed her skirt, then walked to the mirror in her hallway. Looking back at her was a 72-year-old woman with silver hair and kind eyes, exactly the sort of person that David and Sophie expected to intimidate and manipulate. They saw someone vulnerable, someone past her prime, someone whose best days were behind her. They had no idea they were looking at a predator who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of taking down people exactly like them. Helen adjusted her cardigan and checked her watch. 5:45 p.m. David and Sophie would arrive in 15 minutes, confident in their plan and certain of their success. They would walk into her dining room thinking they were about to complete the financial seduction of a confused old woman. Instead, they would be walking into the culmination of a professional investigation conducted by one of the most successful fraud hunters in the history of the Pacific Northwest insurance industry. Helen Morrison had spent decades learning how to appear harmless while methodically destroying the lives of people who preyed on the vulnerable. Tonight, Margaret Helen Cartwright was going to remind the world why she'd never lost a case. The doorbell rang at exactly 6:00 p.m. Helen took a deep breath, smoothed her expression into one of gentle confusion, and went to greet her son and daughter-in-law. It was time for the performance of her lifetime. Helen opened the front door with the same warm smile she'd worn for countless family dinners over the decades. David stood on her doorstep, holding a bouquet of grocery store roses, the kind of generic gesture that spoke more to guilt than genuine affection. Sophie clutched a leather portfolio against her chest like armor, her smile bright and predatory. "Mom, you look wonderful," David said, leaning in for the perfunctory kiss on the cheek that had replaced real embraces sometime in the past few years. "We brought you flowers." "How thoughtful," Helen replied, accepting the roses with every appearance of delight. "Come in, dinner's almost ready." She led them through the familiar hallway past the family photos that chronicled decades of birthdays and holidays and graduations. David moved with the casual confidence of someone who'd grown up in this house, but Sophie's eyes were already calculating measuring rooms and assessing values with the practiced efficiency of someone trained to catalog assets. Tommy emerged from the kitchen carrying a water pitcher, his face carefully neutral. "Hey, Dad, Sophie." David's expression tightened slightly. "Tommy, I didn't know you'd be here." "Grandma invited me for dinner," Tommy replied, which was true enough. He'd been here for 2 hours, but David didn't need to know that. "Said she was making pot roast." Helen watched the brief exchange with professional interest. David was clearly uncomfortable with the unexpected presence of a witness, but he couldn't object without revealing his true intentions. Sophie, meanwhile, was already adapting her smile, never wavering, as she processed this new variable in their carefully planned evening. They were good at this, Helen admitted privately. If she hadn't spent 30 years studying criminal psychology, she might have missed the subtle signs of calculation beneath their familial warmth. "Well, the more the merrier," Sophie said brightly. "We have so much to share with you tonight, Helen. Some really exciting opportunities." Helen led them into the dining room, where the table was set with her best china and crystal, the wedding set that had seen 43 years of family celebrations. The irony of using it for this particular gathering wasn't lost on her. Tonight would indeed be memorable, just not in the way David and Sophie expected. As they settled into their chairs, Helen's hidden recording devices captured every word, every gesture, every telling glance between the conspirators. The digital recorder behind the fruit bowl was positioned perfectly to pick up conversations from the dining room, while her laptop in the living room provided video backup through its webcam. In her previous career, Helen had learned that the best evidence came from allowing criminals to incriminate themselves. People who thought they were in control of a situation often revealed far more than they intended, especially when they believed their target was vulnerable and unsuspecting. "So," Helen said as she served the pot roast that had been simmering all afternoon, "what did you want to show me?" Sophie's eyes lit up with anticipation. She opened her leather portfolio and pulled out a stack of glossy brochures. "We found some absolutely beautiful senior communities, Helen. Places where you could really enjoy your golden years without all the stress of maintaining this big house." Helen accepted the brochures with appropriate interest, noting that Sophie had done her homework. These weren't the cheap institutional facilities that appeared in most elder abuse cases. These were upscale communities with golf courses and spa services, the kind of places that would justify transferring significant assets to pay for appropriate care. They look lovely, Helen said, flipping through pictures of smiling seniors playing tennis and attending art classes. But quite expensive, I imagine. Well, that's the beauty of it, David interjected, leaning forward with practiced enthusiasm. When you sell this house, you'll have more than enough to cover the entrance fees and monthly costs. Plus, you won't have to worry about property taxes and maintenance expenses eating into your retirement savings. Helen nodded thoughtfully as if considering this for the first time. I suppose that makes sense. But I do love this house. Your father and I built so many memories here. Of course you did. Sophie's voice was honey-sweet with understanding. But memories are in your heart, not in a building. And honestly, Helen, we've been worried about you managing all these responsibilities by yourself. Worried? Helen allowed a note of confusion to creep into her voice. In what way? David and Sophie exchanged a glance quick, but not quick enough to escape Helen's notice. This was the moment they'd been building toward the transition from persuasion to manipulation. Well, David said carefully, you've seemed a little scattered lately, forgetting appointments, getting confused about bills. Nothing serious, but at your age, it's natural for these things to become more challenging. Helen bit back her immediate response, which would have been to ask for specific examples of this supposed confusion. Instead, she played her role. Have I been scattered? I haven't noticed. That's exactly what we're talking about. Sophie said, her voice full of gentle concern. Sometimes these changes are so gradual that we don't recognize them ourselves. That's why it's so important to have family looking out for us. Tommy shifted in his chair, and Helen could see the effort it was taking for him to remain silent. His father was gaslighting his grandmother, trying to convince her that her own perceptions of her mental state were unreliable. It was psychological abuse, pure and simple, and Tommy was watching it happen in real time. I brought something that might help, Sophie continued, pulling a document from her portfolio. It's just a simple power of attorney form, standard estate planning stuff. But if you signed it, it would mean that if something ever happened to you, a medical emergency or anything like that, David could step in and handle your financial affairs without having to go through complicated legal procedures. Helen accepted the document and pretended to study it, though she'd already analyzed every clause that afternoon. It was a comprehensive power of attorney that would give David immediate control over her bank accounts, investments, and property. Once signed, she would essentially become a financial prisoner in her own life. It looks very thorough, she said mildly. The lawyer said it covers all the important situations, David added. Medical decisions, financial management, property transactions, everything you might need help with as you get older. Helen set the document aside and looked around the table at her family, David watching her with the focused intensity of a salesman closing a deal, Sophie maintaining her mask of concern while internally calculating commissions, and Tommy, whose face was a study in barely controlled outrage. You know, Helen said conversationally, this reminds me of a case I once heard about. An elderly woman whose family convinced her to sign similar papers, supposedly for her own protection. Oh, Sophie's voice was carefully neutral. Yes, it was quite tragic. The woman thought she was just being responsible, planning ahead for potential problems. But it turned out her children were planning to use those documents to steal everything she owned. Helen's voice remained pleasant, almost chatty. They had this whole elaborate scheme worked out: how to isolate her, how to convince people she was incompetent, how to gain control of her assets without her realizing what was happening. David's fork paused halfway to his mouth. That sounds terrible. What happened to them? Helen's smile was serene. They went to prison, 25 years each of them. Federal fraud charges carry very serious penalties, especially when they involve elder abuse. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sophie's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. David set down his fork and cleared his throat. "Well, that's completely different from our situation," he said, forcing a laugh. "We're trying to help you not steal from you." "Of course you are," Helen agreed. Just like those children thought they were helping their mother. They convinced themselves that taking control of her money was actually protecting her from her own poor judgment. She stood up and began clearing dinner plates with the same efficient movements she'd used for decades of family meals. But this time, each motion was deliberate, purposeful, building toward a moment that she'd been orchestrating since the investigation began. The really interesting part, Helen continued as she stacked plates, was how the investigators caught them. You see, they thought they were so clever, but they made one crucial mistake. "What was that?" Tommy asked right on cue. Helen paused in her clearing and looked directly at David and Sophie. They assumed their victim was helpless. They never considered the possibility that she might be more capable than she appeared. David's face was starting to show the first signs of real concern. "Mom, what are you getting at?" Helen set down the plates and walked to her laptop in the living room. With a few keystrokes, she opened the files she'd prepared that afternoon: bank records, credit reports, surveillance photos, and documented evidence of a conspiracy that would have impressed her former colleagues with its thoroughness. "I'm getting at the fact that I know about Tommy's attempt to hack my bank accounts," she said, her voice still conversational, but now carrying an undertone of steel. "I know about your meeting with the lawyer to discuss power of attorney procedures. I know about Sophie's employment history with Senior Care Solutions." The color drained from Sophie's face. David looked confused, but Sophie understood immediately that their cover had been blown. "I know about your financial problems, David. The credit card debt, the personal loans, the fact that you're 3 months behind on your mortgage." Helen's voice remained calm, but each word landed like a physical blow. "I know about your plan to have me declared incompetent, to gain control of my assets, and to sell this house while warehousing me in the cheapest facility you could find." David started to speak, but Helen held up her hand. "Most importantly," she continued, "I know exactly who you're dealing with, and that's where you made your fatal mistake." She turned the laptop screen toward them, displaying the photograph of her receiving the Investigator of the Year award 30 years ago. "Meet Margaret Helen Cartwright, Senior Financial Crimes Investigator for Pacific Northwest Insurance. 30 years of experience hunting down people who prey on vulnerable seniors. 47 successful prosecutions. 0 cases lost." Sophie's face went white as paper. David stared at the screen in shocked silence, his mind clearly struggling to process this information. "You see," Helen continued, "you spent months researching my financial situation, but you never bothered to research me. You assumed I was just a lucky widow who happened to inherit some money. You never asked how I actually built the wealth you're trying to steal." She clicked to the next screen, showing the evidence she'd gathered over the past 48 hours. "I have recordings of your conversations about staging accidents to make me appear incompetent. I have documentation of your attempts to access my financial accounts. I have proof of your conspiracy to defraud me of nearly $2 million in assets." Her voice hardened. "I have everything I need to send you both to federal prison for the next 25 years. David finally found his voice. "You're bluffing. You can't have. We were careful." "Were you careful when Tommy told you about my bank security being too sophisticated for someone with memory problems? Were you careful when you accessed my accounts from the library 3 weeks ago? Were you careful when Sophie used her training from a company currently under federal investigation for elder abuse?" Each question hit like a hammer blow. David's confident facade was crumbling, replaced by the desperate look of someone who just realized they'd walked into a trap. Sophie, meanwhile, had gone completely silent, her calculating mind probably working through legal options and escape strategies. But Helen had seen that look before in the faces of countless criminals who'd finally understood that their schemes had unraveled. "This is impossible," David whispered. "You're 72 years old. I can't have what maintained my professional skills, kept up with technology, built a network of contacts in law enforcement and legal circles." Helen's smile was sharp as a blade. "David, I've been investigating financial crime since before you were born. Did you really think retirement had made me helpless?" Tommy finally spoke up, his voice shaking with emotion. "Dad, she's been 3 steps ahead of you from the beginning. Every move you made, she was watching. Every plan you hatched, she was recording. You never had a chance." David turned to his son with dawning horror. "You knew about this." "I've been helping her for the past 2 hours," Tommy said proudly. "Someone in this family had to have some integrity." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Sophie's rapid breathing. Helen could see the moment when the full scope of their situation finally sank in. They were trapped, recorded, and facing federal prosecution by someone who had never lost a case in 3 decades of hunting people exactly like them. David slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. "What do you want?" Helen's smile was triumphant but not cruel. She'd gotten her answers, her evidence, and her confession. Now came the justice. "What I want," she said, "is for you to understand that the confused old woman you thought you could manipulate never existed. What I want is for you to realize that the person sitting across from you is the same investigator who built a 30-year career destroying the lives of people who prey on seniors." She closed the laptop and looked at each of them in turn. "And what I want is to watch you face the consequences of trying to steal from someone who wrote the book on catching thieves." 6 months later, Helen Morrison sat in the front row of courtroom 4B in the federal building, watching as her son and daughter-in-law learned the price of their betrayal. Judge Patricia Whitmore, a woman Helen had worked with on several cases during her career, presided over the proceedings with the stern efficiency that had made her legendary in legal circles. The trial had been swift and decisive. When you had recordings of the defendants discussing their criminal plans, documentation of their financial desperation, and testimony from their own accomplice turned witness, the outcome was never really in doubt. Helen's evidence had been so comprehensive that David and Sophie's attorney had spent most of his time trying to negotiate plea bargains rather than mounting any meaningful defense. The court hereby sentences David Morrison to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years supervised probation, Judge Whitmore announced. Additionally, Mr. Morrison will pay full restitution to the victim in the amount of $600,000, representing the assets he attempted to fraudulently obtain, plus punitive damages. David's shoulders shook as the bailiff placed handcuffs around his wrists. In 6 months, he'd lost his job, his house, his marriage, and now his freedom. Sophie had already accepted a plea deal that would send her to minimum security prison for 8 months, but she'd also agreed to testify against her husband in exchange for a lighter sentence. Helen felt no satisfaction in watching her sons collapse, only a deep sadness for the man he'd chosen to become. The David being led away in handcuffs bore little resemblance to the boy she'd raised, the young man who'd once had such promise and potential. But she felt no guilt either. David had made his choices, and consequences were the natural result of actions. If she'd learned anything in 30 years of investigating financial crimes, it was that people who prey on the vulnerable rarely stopped until they were stopped. As the courtroom emptied, Tommy approached her with tears in his eyes. "Grandma Nell, I'm so sorry for all of it." Helen took his hands in hers, the same gesture she'd made 6 months ago when he'd confessed his part in the conspiracy. "You have nothing to apologize for. You did the right thing when it mattered most. Tommy had received immunity in exchange for his cooperation, but more importantly, he'd found the courage to stand up to his father when family loyalty conflicted with basic decency. That took a kind of strength that Helen deeply respected. "What happens now?" he asked. Helen smiled, and for the first time in months, it was entirely genuine. "Now we move forward." The aftermath of the trial had transformed Helen's life in ways she couldn't have imagined. The story of the retired fraud investigator who caught her own family trying to steal from her had made national news, turning her into an unlikely celebrity in the fight against elder abuse. She'd been interviewed by news programs, invited to speak at conferences, and consulted by law enforcement agencies dealing with similar cases. More importantly, she'd found a new purpose that felt like a natural extension of her professional legacy. Helen Morrison, she'd decided to keep using her married name rather than reverting to Margaret Helen Cartwright, had founded the Elder Justice Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping seniors protect themselves from financial exploitation. Using her own story as a template, she developed educational programs that taught older adults how to recognize the warning signs of family fraud and how to protect their assets from predatory relatives. The work was deeply satisfying in a way that retirement never had been. Every senior citizen she helped protect, every family scam she helped expose, felt like a small victory against the kind of casual cruelty that had nearly destroyed her own life. Tommy had become her full-time assistant, using his technology skills to help elderly victims secure their digital assets and gather evidence of abuse. He'd also returned to college to study criminal justice, inspired by his grandmother's example to build a career helping vulnerable people rather than exploiting them. 6 weeks after the trial, Helen stood in the kitchen of her beautiful house, the house that David and Sophie had planned to steal from her, preparing Sunday dinner for a very different kind of family gathering. Tommy was setting the table while his girlfriend, a lovely young woman named Sarah, who worked for a victims' rights organization, arranged flowers from Helen's garden. Richard Hawthorne, her attorney and longtime friend, would be arriving soon with his wife, Margaret. So would Janet Williams from the library, who'd become a close friend since helping Helen gather evidence against her son. Detective Maria Santos from the Financial Crimes Division would be there too, along with her partner and their teenage daughter. This was Helen's new family, people who'd chosen to be part of her life rather than people who'd felt entitled to her assets. It was smaller than her original family, but infinitely more genuine. As she checked the roast beef in the oven, the same recipe she'd been making for 40 years, Helen reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. 18 months ago, she'd been a lonely widow going through the motions of retirement, believing that her best years were behind her. She'd measured her worth by how useful she could be to her children, how much she could contribute to their happiness and success. Now, at 73, she was busier and more fulfilled than she'd been in decades. The Elder Justice Initiative was expanding to 3 new states. She was working on a book about family financial fraud that already had interest from major publishers. Most importantly, she was using her expertise to protect other people from experiencing the betrayal she'd endured. The doorbell rang, and Tommy called out that he'd get it. Helen could hear voices in the hallway, Richard's booming laugh, Margaret's warm greeting, the excited chatter of Maria's daughter discussing her latest school project. These were the sounds of real family, Helen realized. Not people who saw her as a source of money or a burden to be managed, but people who valued her for who she was and what she contributed to their lives. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Helen almost deleted it without reading, but something made her open it instead. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Linda Rodriguez. I saw your story on the news. I think my daughter is trying to steal from me. Can you help?" Helen smiled and typed back, "I'll call you tomorrow morning." You're not alone. She wasn't just Helen Morrison anymore, she realized. She wasn't just the woman whose son had tried to steal from her, or the retired investigator who'd caught her own family in a criminal conspiracy. She was something new, a protector, an advocate, a voice for people who'd been silenced by those who should have loved them most. The transformation was complete. The confused, helpless elderly woman that David and Sophie had planned to exploit had never existed. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and more dangerous to predators than Margaret Helen Cartwright had ever been. Because now she wasn't just hunting criminals for an insurance company. Now she was hunting them for every grandmother who'd ever been betrayed by someone they trusted. And Helen Morrison was just getting started. As her friends gathered around the dinner table, the same table where David and Sophie had planned her destruction, Helen raised her glass of wine in a toast. To family, she said, looking around at the faces of people who'd chosen to love her rather than use her. To justice, and to the fact that it's never too late to discover who you're really meant to be. The glasses clinked together in harmony, and Helen Morrison, fraud fighter, advocate, and survivor, smiled as she began the next chapter of a life that was far from over. Outside, the roses in her garden bloomed in perfect splendor, having survived another winter to grow stronger and more beautiful than ever before, just like their gardener. And that, my dear friends, is how Helen Morrison went from victim to victor. Can you imagine the look on David and Sophie's faces when they realized they'd tried to scam a retired fraud investigator? Sometimes justice comes in the most beautiful, unexpected packages. Helen's story reminds us that our experience isn't a weakness, it's our superpower. Age doesn't make us vulnerable. It makes us wise, strategic, and absolutely formidable when we need to be. If Helen's story resonates with you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with every strong woman in your life. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been underestimated because of your age? How did you prove them wrong? And remember, if you or someone you know is facing elder abuse or financial exploitation, there are resources available. You are never too old to fight back, and you are never alone. Until next time, keep being the amazing, powerful women you are. I'll see you in the next story.